Agriculture contributes about 33% of all the emissions of the world, depending a little bit on how you count it, but it's anywhere from 26 to 33. And we can't get to net zero. We don't get this job done unless agriculture is front and center as part of the solution. But with a growing population on the planet, we just crossed the threshold of 8 billion fellow citizens around the world. We just crossed that in this last year. Emissions from the food system alone are projected to cause another 0.5 degree of warming by mid-century on the current course that we are today. A 2-degree future could result in an additional 600 million people not getting enough to eat. And you just can't continue to both warm the planet while also expecting to feed it. Doesn't work. So we have to reduce emissions from the food system to keep the 1.5 degrees alive. Why do we have to keep 1.5 degrees alive? Because scientists, as a basis of physics and mathematics, not ideology and politics or party labels or anything else, as a matter of physics and mathematics and some biology and chemistry have told us these are the consequences. And we already see it happening. And almost everything they've predicted for 30 plus years now is coming true, but the problem is it's coming true faster and bigger than was in fact predicted.
It's all wrong. I shouldn't be up here. I should be back in school on the other side of the ocean. Yet you all come to us young people for hope. How dare you? You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words, and yet I'm one of the lucky ones. People are suffering, people are dying, entire ecosystems are collapsing. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you? For more than 30 years, the science has been crystal clear. How dare you continue to look away and come here saying that you're doing enough when the politics and solutions needed are still nowhere in sight? You say you hear us and that you understand the urgency. But no matter how sad and angry I am, I do not want to believe that. Because if you really understood the situation and still kept on failing to act, then you would be evil, and that I refuse to believe.
It's just, it is going to make disaster if we don't turn this ship around. And so it's basically like there's scientific consensus that the lives of children are going to be very difficult. And it does lead, I think, young people to have a legitimate question, you know, is it okay to still have children? And I mean, not just financially, because people are graduating with $20, $30, $100,000 worth of student loan debt, and so they can't even afford to have kids in a house, but also just this basic moral question, like what do we do? And even if you don't have kids, there are still children here in the world, and we have a moral obligation to them, to leave a better world for them. And this idea that if we just, you know, I've been working on this for X amount of years, it's like not good enough. Like we need a universal sense of urgency, and people are trying to like introduce watered down proposals that are frankly going to kill us. A lack of urgency is going to kill us. It doesn't matter if you agree that climate change is an important issue. At this point, it doesn't matter. If you believe climate change is a problem, that's an issue. At this point, it doesn't matter. If you believe climate change is a problem, that's not even the issue. It's the issue is how urgently you feel we need to fix it. And if you do not have a sense of urgency to try to turn this around in 10 years.
Getting rid of fossil fuel is not going to solve the problem fast enough. A Swedish
can eat dead people, but that's not fast enough. So I think the next campaign slogan has to be this: we got to start eating babies. We don't have enough time. There's too much CO2. All of you, you're pollutant. Too much CO2. We have to start now. Please, you are so great. I'm so happy that you're really supporting the Green Deal, but it's not enough. Even if we would bomb Russia, we still have too many people, too much pollution. So we have to get rid of the babies. That's a big problem. Just stopping having babies is not enough. We need to eat the babies.
It's what you stand for in the government right now.
The most maddening part of all of that, though, is that these policies, they're not just destroying lives. They're rooted in lies, all of them. Our next guest was once a climate alarmist, but now says the entire movement is, quote, a scam. Tom Harris is the executive director of the International Climate Science Coalition. He joins me now. Tom, good to see you tonight. Now, you actually say the only way to get rid of this is to go after the science of climate change. Explain.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of people will say, well, Canada, for example, puts out so little greenhouse gas emissions that we shouldn't actually try to reduce it because China is double the United States. Well, the trouble is people argue that, well, yes, but we have to set an example to the world and we have to be good citizens and all that sort of thing. So they're using these arguments quite often that China's doubled the emissions of the U.S., et cetera. But the real underlying thing is that there is no climate crisis. I was originally an aerospace engineer, and I would give speeches and I wrote articles. I wrote one in the Ottawa Citizen about comparative planetology, how studying the planets helps us understand the Earth better. And I used the example of the runaway greenhouse effect on Venus. I said, this could happen on the Earth if we don't reduce carbon dioxide. Well, a local professor at Carleton University, professor of geology, he liked my article so much he used it in his course on climate change. But he said to the students, but that part about Venus is wrong. What happened on Venus cannot physically happen on the Earth, and he explained why. Now, I thought, who is this climate change denier? Well, he invited me into his lab, and he showed me the geologic history that he and others are finding, and they found no consistent correlation between carbon dioxide and Earth's temperature. At times, CO2 was 1,300% of today, and we were stuck in very cold conditions. So it was all over the board. So I started wondering, well, maybe he's right. He exposed me to a lot of people who actually showed me that there are thousands of scientists. And here's a book actually that illustrates that. It's called Climate Change Reconsidered. And this is on climatechangereconsidered.org. There are thousands of references here which talk about the fact that there is no foundation to the climate scare. It's all based on models that don't work.
The courage needed to solve climate change is nothing compared with the courage needed to start a family. The true heroes of this story aren't politicians, and they aren't social media activists. They are moms and dads, and the little boys and girls that they are at this very moment putting down for naps or helping with their homework, building tree houses and teaching them how to tie their shoes. The planet does not need for us to think globally and act locally so much as it needs us to think family and act personally. The solution to climate change is not this unserious resolution that we're considering this week in the Senate, but rather the serious business of human flourishing. The solution to so many of our problems at all times and in all places is to fall in love, get married, and have some kids. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
So, Alex, we've been told for a long time the climate change emergency is settled science. It looks like it's no longer settled. What happened?
Well, there's a series of 3 new peer-reviewed papers published in major prestigious scientific journals just over the last month or so. And taken together, they completely undermine the alleged scientific consensus on man-made global warming. One of them found that about 40% of the observed warming can be explained away using the urban heat island effect. So to try to summarize that, basically a lot of these thermometers were put out there in an open field, in a rural area. A city was built up around it, and so it gets warmer, obviously, not because there's global warming, but because there's a city around the thermometer. The rest of the warming, they found, can be easily explained using changes in solar activity that NASA has been tracking meticulously for many decades. And so right now, these are in the peer-reviewed literature, and instead of responding to this, you've got the climate establishment going on Twitter and saying these guys are basically poo-poo heads and clowns and deniers. So at this point, you wonder, do they have a scientific response? Because if they did, they would probably write a peer-reviewed paper to refute the ones that just undermined their claims.
Well, how did they get them in? It's hard to get a peer-reviewed paper when it comes to these topics. What was the kind of hole in the wall that brought this about, so to speak?
You're right. It is very hard to get any peer-reviewed studies in the journals because there's almost like an iron wall blocking this. And we got some insight into this during the ClimateGate scandal in 2009 when a bunch of emails were hacked and leaked to the public showing a bunch of so-called climate scientists, in fact, some of the leading so-called climate scientists, conspiring to hide their data from other researchers, conspiring to hide the decline in global temperatures, and conspiring to silence any scientists who wouldn't go along with the narrative, keep them out of the journals, keep them out of TV, media interviews, etc. And so what happened is these papers were just really solid. These three journals that published them, they're not known for being, climate denier publications, but the science was very sound. They did one special issue in the journal Climate, for example. They had some guest editors, including Dr. Ned Nikolov, who I wrote about back in 2017. They looked at this. They said, wow, this is correct as best as we can tell. So the peers looked at it, they accepted it, and this is a really prestigious team, Josh. We're talking about almost 40 scientists from around the world. The lead author, Dr. Willie Soon, one of the world's top astrophysicists, if not the top astrophysicist. He used to be at the Harvard Smithsonian. You've got Ronan Connolly. These are very, very well-established, very prestigious, highly credentialed experts, and it's good to finally see some alternative viewpoints published in the peer-reviewed literature. I think the dam is finally cracking, Josh.
Yeah, well, what I've heard from a lot of people before was that nobody dares say it. Everybody understands it, nobody dares say it. What effect are we seeing now that some pretty credible people are stepping forward on this?
That's exactly right. And I reached out to a lot of scientists for my article in the Epoch Times about this. And over again, I kept saying, I'd love to comment, but I can't because my funding is going to be jeopardized. My grant's going to be jeopardized. If I get associated with saying that these papers are important, I'm going to be, labeled and I won't be able to participate anymore in scientific debates. So there's still a very real sense that that's going on. But when you look at the scientists behind these papers, for example, Dr. Willie Soon, these are people who've now moved away from the major institutions. Dr. Willie Soon ended his time at Harvard Smithsonian last year, and they're now working independently. So they have an organization called CERES. That's the real issue, right? Any scientist who comes out and says, hey, the UN is not telling the truth, the federal government's not telling the truth, their grants are going to dry up. If they're not tenured, they're going to be at risk of losing their job. But when you take a bunch of scientists who are completely independent, who don't need federal grants, who don't need to participate with the UN, they have a lot more freedom, and I think that's what's going on here.